time to bring our people back home.
To end America's longest war.
The U.S. will soon complete its withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan.
Alarming images.
Taliban fighters have flooded the capital.
Their American-made weapons in the hands of Taliban.
Death. War. Destructions. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is a landlocked and mountainous country that connects the Middle East with Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Thus, the country is bordered by Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and China. Moreover, with a surface area of 652,000 square kilometers, the country is home to more than 40 million people. However, Afghanistan has suffered from such chronic instability and conflict during its modern history that its economy and infrastructure are in ruins, and many of its people are refugees. The Afghanistan War is an international conflict that is very complex, and it begins in 2001 due to the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center in the United States. From then, the US and its allies invaded Afghanistan, in which they begins a bombing campaign against the Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces. The Taliban regime ended when the Taliban leader Mullah Omar fled the city. However, they continued to hide out in the mountains and to southern Afghanistan and across the border to Pakistan to mobilize their troops. Following the fall of the Taliban group, the new government was established with the help from the US, who tried to establish a reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan for over 20 years, but struggled to develop any coherent strategy and signed a declaration to withdraw their troops in the midst of 2020. Here is the footage of the US envoy Khalilzad and the Taliban Baradar signed an agreement that paved the way for the US troops' withdrawal in Afghanistan, in which the Taliban guaranteed that the country will not be used for terrorist activity. After that, President Biden announced that the United States will have a troop withdrawal by September 11, and NATO troops in Afghanistan will also leave. This is the footage of the US soldier board a helicopter leaving Afghanistan. With minimal opposition, Taliban fighters took the capital Kabul and took over the presidential palace hours after President Ashraf Ghani left the country, which marked the end of the 20-year of Afghanistan conflict. Hence, in order to understand the whole context of the conflict itself, we have to look further into causes and effects, actors, dynamics, consequences, as well as the process of conflict resolutions. Moreover, we want to know why the conflict ended with so many Taliban gains, and what lesson can be drawn from this conflict, since the conflict itself took 2 decades to resolve and caused many devastating casualties. Therefore, in this content of this video, we will dive deep through the conflict itself to find out more about the aforementioned aspects.
The issue started with Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th plane crashes in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Close to 3,000 people died in the attacks. Although Afghanistan is the base for Al-Qaeda, none of the 19 hijackers are Afghan nationals. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian, led the group, and 15 of the hijacks originated from Saudi Arabia. President George W. Bush vows to win the war against terrorism, and later zeroes in on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. President Bush eventually calls on the Taliban regime to deliver to the United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your hands or share in their fate. President George W. Bush signed into law a joint resolution authorizing the use of force against those responsible for attacking the United States on 9/11. This joint resolution will later be cited by the Bush administration as legal rationale for its decision to take sweeping measures to combat terrorism, from invading Afghanistan to eavesdropping on the US citizens without a court order, to standing up to the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The conflict started to progress with complexity involving the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and the United States. The dynamic changes as the United States struggled to pursue the conflict aggressively while passing along the same problem from presidents to presidents. Consequently, it can be seen that the intervention in Afghanistan had little success, causing only more death and destruction than intended. Still, thousands of Afghans who assisted the United States and its allies, as well as up to 200 Americans, remain in Afghanistan. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Washington will work to get them out, and that future U.S. engagement in Afghanistan will focus on diplomacy instead. The realists criticize America's post-Cold War ambitions to build a liberal worldwide hegemony. They contend both the Republican and Democratic administrations have dangerously overextended America's military intervention across the world for humanitarian and democracy promotion goals that are hostile to America's basic interests. Whether in Somalia, Bosnia, or Kosovo, these operations often wasted American blood and cash, undermining the country's international authority. Realists claim that America's increased military presence in the Arabian Gulf and the Middle East fuel anti-American sentiment and encourage the emergence of a worldwide jihadist movement antagonistic to Western interests. As a result, the 9/11 attack reflected Al-Qaeda's resentment of the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. These opponents contend that Americans' military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq have undermined the United States' geomilitary stature in the world, boosted Russia and China, and deliberated the United States' economic vitality and worldwide legitimacy. Only by withdrawing from the Afghan and Iraqi crisis and militarily disengaging from the Middle East will America be able to maintain its strategic capabilities to resist developing global hegemons. Though supporters of strategic restraint disagree on the magnitude of U.S. withdrawal required across the world, the essential elements of this revolutionist grand plan are plainly discernible. All agree that the U.S. forces should be relocated from fighting zones in the Muslim world, that the American military presence in Europe should be significantly reduced or abolished, that American military spending should be decreased, and that diplomacy should be increased to meet growing challenges. Military action is only employed as a final option when all methods have failed. In combination with constructivism, the U.S. military creates a civil affairs framework to coordinate redevelopment with UN and non-governmental organizations and to expand the authority of Kabul government. These so-called provincial reconstruction teams, or PTRs, have stood up first in Gardez in November, followed by Bamiyan, Kunduz, Mazar-e-Sharif, Kandahar, and Herat. Command for individual PRTs is eventually handed over to NATO instead. While credited with improving security for aid agencies, the model is not universally praised. Concern mounts that the PTR system lacks central controlling authority, is disorganized, and creates what a U.S. Institute of Peace report calls an ad hoc approach to security and development. Such criticism grows beyond the PTR's program and becomes a common theme in the NATO war effort. Critics contend with this limit the coalition's effectiveness. Be that as it may, the keynote is that the international organizations such as the UN put effort into assisting the reconstruction of Afghanistan.
This conflict has been ongoing for nearly 20 years. So the question remains on what conflict resolution has been done so far. On February 2019, the US and the Taliban have signed an agreement that paved the way for a significant drawdown of the US troops in Afghanistan. That agreement includes the guarantee from Taliban that the country will not be used for terrorist activity and for Taliban to agree to participate in an intra-Afghan dialogue on the country's political structure as well as a ceasefire. On September 12, 2020, the intra-Afghan peace talk has begun. The representative from Taliban and from Afghan government and civil society have met face to face for the first time in Doha, Qatar, after nearly 20 years of war. The direct negotiation, which first delayed for months over prisoner swap proposed earlier in the US-Taliban deal, began after the Afghan government completed the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners. Following that, on April 14, 2021, the newly elected President of the United States, President Joe Biden, had resigned on completely withdrawal of the U.S. troops by September 11, 2021. The remaining 3,500 troops in Afghanistan will be withdrawn regardless of whether the progress is made in intra-Afghan peace talks or whether the Taliban reduce its attack on Afghan security forces and citizens. The troops have completely withdrawn on August 30, 2021. Now that the Taliban have taken over the country and trying to be a legitimate government, the next question is what can be done to resolve this conflict. First, it is important to recognize the remaining need for political settlement in Afghanistan, as well as gaining Afghan and international community trust. Rather than write off an Afghan peace process as dead in the water, it is more constructive to view it as a multi-year, adaptive, and ongoing process of bringing all sides together to build a bridge and reach a common understanding for the future of Afghanistan. Second, the United Nations is best suited to mediate a step-by-step roadmap toward strengthening humanitarian and development cooperation. This has led by the example of UNICEF coordinating access to education with the Taliban and have planned to directly finance Afghan teachers. Both UNICEF and the World Health Organization have also initiated a polio immunization campaign with the Taliban support in October. The Taliban allowed a national polio vaccination campaign led by the UN to proceed and said it is committed to allow women to participate as a frontline worker. And last but not least, the UN also led a way in promoting a developmental approach to a food security, as this is the major concern in Afghanistan currently because they have been severely affected on the food shortage, especially in the time of COVID-19.
We have now finally come to our conclusions. We found out that the conflict started with the Al-Qaeda crushing commercial airliners into World Trade Center in United States, and from then on, the war has undergone under many phases of war, destruction, as well as peace talk, which it came to an end earlier this year when the US withdrew all their troops and the Taliban took control over Afghanistan. As for the United Nations, they have only strengthened humanitarian and development cooperations, and they did not involve further. For the theoretical analysis, we choose the realists to explain our stances. Thus, the realists have criticized both the Republican and Democratic administrations have dangerously overextended American military interventions across the world for humanitarian and democracy promotion goals that are hostile to American basic interests, as well as fuel an anti-American sentiment. Therefore, only by withdrawing from Afghanistan will America be able to maintain its strategic capability to resist developing global hegemony. It is undeniable that we feel that the 20-year wars in Afghanistan is worth it. We think that there are a lot of flaws during the 20 years of the US occupations in Afghanistan, and the Afghan government itself was very corrupted, and they have a weak military capacity, despite the fact that the US and British provided them countless aids. And in the end, they were not the one who suffered from the loss and consequences. The ones who suffered are the millions of Afghan people who have now become refugees. Moreover, an estimated 221,000 people have died as a direct result of the conflict, and hundreds of thousands more, mostly civilians, have died due to hunger, disease, and injury caused by the devastating war. At least 2.7 million of Afghanistan population have been forced to flee due to the war, becoming refugees in neighboring countries such as Pakistan, Iran, and beyond. Therefore, we can see that the one false step of leader can lead to many devastating casualties. All in all, we learned that the action have consequences. What started by the terrorism group during the 9/11 incident have led the United States to implement self-defense and retaliations toward the group. However, the country clapped back toward the terrorism group was not well planned, thus subsequently impact Afghanistan as a whole in the critical sense of realism. Should the US plan a better coordinated confrontations against a terrorism group that would not affect the many other aspects of Afghanistan, this mission would be a success and the current terrorist authority would not have established control over the country.